Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're undertaking a kind of deep excavation. We're not really interested in memorizing, lists of emperors or mapping out all the military campaigns.
Right. That's not the point
Our
at all.
mission, based on this really diverse stack of sources we've distilled, is, well, it's far more fundamental. We want to trace the cultural, the political, and the philosophical DNA of Han civilization right back to its absolute root.
To the source code.
Exactly. To understand the logic of order, of harmony, and this incredible continuity that allowed this particular identity, this political structure, to scale and just endure for millennia.
It's a really crucial distinction to make. We're looking for the software, not just the hardware of the Chinese state.
The operating system.
Yeah, the cultural operating system. And to do that, you have to start before the dynasties. I mean, way before.
Yeah.
Before the written script, and certainly before any of the formal philosophical schools were even a thing. Because the sources make this really compelling case that the root code of Han identity, it wasn't written in a book. It was written in the soil itself.
Okay, so let's unpack that. That's the core premise, right? We're starting not with a conqueror or some capital city, but with geography, specifically the Yellow River.
Right. Gopangki.
And our sources describe it as, well, not just a source of life. It's the primary creator and destroyer of the earliest communities in this whole region. So how does a geographical reality like that translate directly into a specific enduring culture?
You really have to picture the scale of it and the sheer capriciousness of the Yellow River. It's often called China's sorrow for a reason.
Right.
It flows for nearly 300 to 400 miles, and it carries this immense amount of sediment, this low S, which gives it that classic yellow color. For the early communities, it presented this relentless cycle.
A cycle of what, exactly?
Of creation and destruction. So the river would retreat after a flood, and it would leave behind this low S, which is this incredibly fine, fertile, easily worked soil.
Perfect for farming.
Perfect for growing the early staple, which was millet. So that's the creator. That's the giver of life.
The bounty.
Yes, but then came the destroyer. The sources all emphasize its total unpredictability. I mean, this is not the Nile, with its nice predictable flood cycles that you can set your calendar by.
No.
The Yellow River was and is infamous for changing its course dramatically. Sometimes about hundreds of miles just gone, wiping out entire settlements, submerging farmland in these absolutely catastrophic floods. So survival was always, inherently conditional. It was never, ever guaranteed.
So if nature itself, the very thing that gives you life, is constantly threatening to just undo your entire existence, what does that force you to do in terms of human organization?
It necessitates coordination, above all else. This period, we're talking roughly 7,000 years ago, saw the emergence of these settled communities. They're growing millet, they're domesticating pigs, building houses from compacted earth.
Okay.
Their entire lives were dictated by the rhythm of that river.
Yeah.
But the scale of the threat, a flood that big, individual effort was completely insufficient.
You couldn't build a dike by yourself.
You couldn't even build one as a single village.
Yeah.
So the deep takeaway that the sources highlight is that survival depended not on who could conquer the next valley or, who had the best weapons. It depended entirely on the collective ability to manage the water.
I find this interpretation just fascinating, that cooperation was literally cultural DNA forged out of pure necessity. It's not some, utopian moral ideal that a sage preached from a mountaintop.
No, not at all.
It wasn't about being good. It was about not drowning next spring.
Exactly. Imagine the sheer scale of the collective labor required for managing water. You couldn't build effective dikes alone. You had to share canals. You had to coordinate labor between multiple settlements. And this is critical. You had to establish early warning systems.
So sending runners downstream?
Sending runners downstream when the water crested upstream. This was institutional memory and cooperation developed over countless generations of trial and a lot of error. This repeated life or death necessity embedded these really fundamental cultural instincts.
And what were those instincts?
Well, they produced a people who deeply, deeply valued harmony, because any internal conflict would mean external failure against the river.
Right. You can't be fighting your neighbor when the flood is coming.
You just can't. They valued balance over unilateral control because you had to work with the natural cycle. You couldn't dominate it. And maybe most importantly, they developed this profound, almost paralyzing fear of chaos, Luan.
Rooted in the terror of the unpredictable flood.
Yes. And that fear of disorder becomes the central philosophical engine that just drives the next 3,000 years of political and social thought in China.
But surely even in those communities, you'd have, the strongest person trying to dominate. How did a hierarchy emerge functionally, like our sources suggest, instead of just violently?
That's where the nature of the labor defines the nature of the leader. As these communities scaled up, the need for management became highly specialized. Think about it. When the dike breaks, the person you need isn't the best fighter. It's the person who knows how to organize 1,000 laborers, like right now. The one who knows where the fault lines are, how to allocate scarce resources like food and tools.
The project manager, basically.
The ultimate project manager. The leaders were those who possessed institutional memory, the ability to read the signs in the river, to predict the floods, to remember the successful rituals from the past, and crucially, to understand the complex astronomy needed for synchronized planting.
So, power just. It flowed from competence, from usefulness in managing the shared environment, not from brute force.
Precisely.
Hmm.
Respect was granted to those who could maintain the order necessary for collective survival. And this stands in really stark contrast to so many other founding myths, where power often emerges from conquest or from some kind of heroic tribal violence. Here, power is fundamental agricultural. It's rooted in the land, and it's earned through organization.
So the core interpretation from the sources is that Han culture isn't built on a single big revolutionary event, like a founding constitution or a singular empire, but on this grinding, necessary cycle of repetition that was dictated by the landscape itself.
Exactly. It was a lived culture first, and only much, much later was it formalized into philosophy.
And that's the origin story of China's immense capacity for bureaucracy.
It is. The instincts for order, the fear of chaos, the absolute necessity of collective effort. These were thousands of years old before the first dynasty was even a name. When we look at the later empires, we're just seeing those same instincts codified into ritual and law and philosophy. The logic of the empire was already there in the millet fields.
That sets such a powerful, deep foundation. Now let's move into the next critical phase. That transition from, simple communities governed by respected elders to the first institutional forms of power, what we'd call the sacred state.
Right.
And this begins with the early kings, specifically the Xia and the Shang.
The sources trace a clear progression here. The Xia dynasty, which is, legendary and still historically debated in some circles.
Right, a bit murky.
It's a bit murky, but it represents the formalization of that organizational role. The respected elder becomes the ritual ruler. The Xia kings are remembered in the tradition as the first figures who mediated explicitly between the visible world of men and the unpredictable world of heaven, or Tian.
So their job description was cosmic.
Entirely cosmic. They performed large-scale sacrifices, they consulted the stars, and their primary function was to ensure the continuity and the predictability of the seasons and the river.
And then the Shang arrives. And this is where we see the birth of a political structure we really recognize, because this is where writing appears, specifically on the oracle bones.
The Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, is archaeologically verifiable, and it is just utterly critical to the story. They were obsessed with pattern, with signs, with finding meaning in the world. So they would take turtle shells, or the scapulae, the shoulder blades of oxen, and they'd inscribe questions on them. Really practical questions.
Like what?
Will the harvest be good? Should we attack the neighboring tribe? Is the king going to be ill? Then they'd apply a hot poker or something to the bone until it cracked. The king and his scribes would then interpret the resulting fissures as the answer from the ancestors, or from heaven itself.
So the king didn't rule by simple decree then, he ruled by interpretation.
Precisely. And this is a foundational political idea. Legitimacy flowed vertically from the cosmos down to the king, but it was mediated through this constant need for reading and interpreting signs. The Shang king wasn't just a general or a magistrate, he was a master metaphysician. His power rested entirely on his unique ability to communicate with the ancestors and divine the will of heaven through those cracks.
That sounds immensely powerful, but also really fragile. Because if the divination failed, or if the king interpreted it wrong and a disaster happened,
his legitimacy was shattered, absolutely. The system was powerful because it was sacred, but it was incredibly fragile because it was arbitrary. Heaven spoke through random cracks. It gave no moral justification for its decisions. One day it's yes, the next it's no.
And that arbitrary nature is key to what comes next.
It's the key to understanding the next revolution.
Okay, but before we get to the zoo, the sources draw a lot of attention to the specific role of bronze technology during the Shang. This wasn't just, a a military or a farming advantage. It was what they call status infrastructure.
Yes, bronze was the high technology of the era. It was difficult to mine, difficult to smelt, difficult to cast. But the Shang reserved its most elaborate use not for weapons, but for ritual vessels,
For the ceremony.
for the ceremonies.
Yeah.
Heavy tripods, ornate cauldrons, and these beautiful wine containers. And only the sacred elite, the royal family and top nobles could possess these objects. If you look at the archaeological record, the type, the size, and the number of bronze vessels found in a tomb literally define the deceased's rank. It was a metal caste system.
So the bronze itself created this visible, physical, and sacred hierarchy.
It reinforced that whole vertical flow of power from heaven down to the king and his elite. It was power you could see and touch.
Okay, now for the radical shift. The Zhou come in, they replace the Shang, but they can't just say, well, we had better bronze or we're better fighters. They had to create a better political and metaphysical argument.
And that's where the mandate of heaven comes in. Tianming.
Right.
This is one of the most brilliant political moves in all of history. When the Zhou conquered the Shang, they needed a justification, a really powerful one. And instead of just claiming that their cracks in the oracle bones were better, they changed the fundamental nature of heaven itself.
How so?
They claimed that heaven, Tian, was no longer arbitrary. It was ethical. It cared about justice, about righteousness, about the welfare of the people.
They moralized the cosmos.
They fused metaphysics with ethics and politics. It was an absolute masterstroke. The Zhou propaganda, which we have records of, argued that the Shang kings had become corrupt, cruel, and hedonistic. They were drunkards. They were torturing people.
Yeah.
And that this behavior had offended the moral heaven.
And heaven's response was?
Disaster, floods, famine, earthquakes. Heaven showed its displeasure and withdrew its mandate, its permission to rule, and then granted it to a more virtuous, more worthy successor, the Zhou.
So this is a truly revolutionary idea. It instantly politicizes morality. Your personal conduct as a ruler now has cosmic consequences.
It's the ultimate fusion. It made power something that was earned morally. It wasn't just inherited automatically or dependent on some random cracks in a bone. And this is the most crucial part. It institutionalized legitimacy of rebellion. If the ruler was cruel or unjust or incompetent, overthrowing him wasn't a crime. It became a righteous, even sacred duty to restore cosmic harmony. And this created that enduring political rhythm that defines Chinese history. This constant tension between absolute order and the necessary revolution required to restore that order.
That's a powerful foundation. And flowing directly out of this morally legitimized system is the idea that ritual itself is not just superstition. The sources call it infrastructure.
Yes. In the Zhou world, ritual was politics. It was governance. Every single major act, from the king planting the first seeds in spring to coronations to managing ancestral graves, was governed by precise ceremony.
So through this constant repetition, society is just rehearsing its values over and over until they become reality.
The action itself enforces the moral code. It turns abstract philosophy into concrete daily movement.
And the Zhou took this a crucial step further by standardizing everything.
Yes, standardization. They realized that to rule a massive, dispersed territory, they couldn't just rely on everyone's local customs. That would lead to chaos. So they created these incredibly detailed manuals, like the Rites of Zhou.
What was in them?
Everything. Manuals for ceremony, for dress, for speech, for interaction. They codified the proper way to bow to your superior, the appropriate color you should wear for mourning your father versus your uncle, the exact sacrifice required for a good harvest.
That sounds incredibly bureaucratic. Thousands of years before we think of bureaucracy really taking hold. They were basically creating a cultural operating system.
They were. And this standardization was absolutely critical for scaling up later. It meant that a nobleman in some distant territory performing the prescribed rites was participating in the exact same political and cultural reality as the king at the center.
It synchronizes the culture.
It creates a shared cultural language of behavior. And that helped prevent the whole territory from dissolving into hundreds of separate little cultures when the political center inevitably weakened, which it did. Ritual, therefore, became the original unifying infrastructure of China.
Okay, so we've established the cultural foundation, the river, and this cosmic political model of moralized ritual. But that very same ritualized feudal Zhou world, it broke down.
It did.
And now we have to confront the great paradox of this whole story, that centuries of brutal, necessary violence led to the centralized order that would ultimately house this civilization.
The Zhou created a feudal order, The central king granted land to local nobles in exchange for tribute and loyalty. It was a very decentralized system.
So for the average person, power was very local.
Intensely local. The village elder, the landlord, the local tax collector, that was your world.
And as we said, culture for the common person was transmitted through practice, right? How to plant, how to mourn, how to speak to your superiors, not through reading philosophy.
Exactly. But as those local lords grew more and more powerful, their loyalty to the distant Zhou king just dissolved. The system was inherently unstable. It was designed to fracture.
Which leads directly into the chaos of the spring and autumn period, and then the really terrifying, protracted conflicts of the Warring States period.
Lasting over 250 years. And you have to understand, this wasn't minor skirmishing. This was industrial-scale total war.
The sources really emphasize that war itself became the engine of state creation. How did warfare change so profoundly during that time?
The technology shifted everything. Bronze, which was the expensive metal of the ritual elite, was replaced by cheap, plentiful iron.
So you could arm everyone?
You could arm massive armies of peasants. Warfare stopped being these aristocratic duels fought by chariots and became about mass conscripted infantry, huge professional armies, and, most importantly, logistics.
Ah, the logistics.
To field an army of 100,000 men and keep them fed and equipped hundreds of miles from home, you need a highly efficient centralized administration. You just do.
So to survive, you had to become radically efficient. The state had to organize itself, or it would simply be conquered and absorbed.
Violence became the ultimate pressure cooker. To survive, these competing states like Qin, Shu, and Qi, they had to innovate their methods of governance. They centralized taxation to fund the huge armies. They standardized laws ruthlessly so that governors could be swapped out. But the system of control remained the same.
And they created professional bureaucracies.
Yes, based on merit, not just birth. They replaced the unreliable, inherited aristocratic positions with men who were competent. So the organized, centralized state structure that the Han Dynasty would later inherit was literally forged in the chaos and the necessity of mass warfare.
The great paradox is just undeniable. Violence created the very order that sought to end violence.
It did.
And this reaches its absolute fever pitch with the Qin shock in 221 BCE. Unity finally arrives, but it's through pure, unadulterated force.
The state of Qin, which was located in the West, was known for its legalist ideology. This philosophy was all about strict, objective law and severe punishment for any infraction. They were the most ruthlessly efficient war machine of the era.
And their leader, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor,
He achieved what centuries of philosophical debate and ritual standardization had failed to do. He unified the entire territory with just dizzying speed.
and the sources detail the scale of his standardization efforts. I mean, he wasn't just conquering lands, he was trying to restructure reality itself.
Total control. That was the goal. He abolished the old Zhou feudal system overnight. He physically destroyed the local aristocracies, moved hundreds of thousands of people for resettlement to break up old loyalties.
And then came the standardization.
The standardization that underpins the whole idea of an invisible empire. He unified weights, measures, currency, and, most crucially, the unified writing script, a foundational act. He even standardized the axle width of carts.
The axle width.
Why? So that all carts could ride in the same ruts carved into the imperial roads everywhere. It made transport and logistics incredibly efficient. Everything was about efficiency.
But the shadow over this unification was terror, famously exemplified by the burning of the books and the burying alive of the scholars.
That's the key tragedy of the Qin. Qin created the machine, the centralized, efficient, standardized administration that China needed to function as one large state. But he did it by shattering the moral and cultural soul of the civilization.
Because legalism saw human nature as what?
As inherently selfish and bad, and therefore required control through fear and severe penalty. The books he burned were the histories, the philosophies, the poetry that referenced the old, decentralized, moralized order of the Zhou past.
He was trying to erase memory.
He was, and the people.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted the stability that centralization provided, but they desperately wanted what you might call unity without cruelty. And the Qin dynasty, for all its power, collapsed after only 15 years due to massive popular revolts fueled by that terror.
And that collapse leaves this huge question hanging for the Han Dynasty that follows. How do you keep the magnificent efficiency of the Qin machine without incurring the terrible cost of its terror?
That's the ingenuity of what we call the Han synthesis. They were smart. They realized they couldn't go back to the fractured feudalism of the Zhou. That was chaos.
Yeah.
But they also couldn't stick with the brutality of the legalist Qin. So their solution was a hybrid system.
How did that work?
They kept the Qin infrastructure, the whole thing. The standardized weights, the centralized taxation, the professional bureaucracy, the unified script, the entire machine.
But they ripped out the software. They replaced the legalist operating system with the moral operating system of Confucianism.
Exactly. They gave the centralized body a moral soul. And in that moment, the classical Chinese state was born. Immensely powerful and centrally organized, but at the same time expected to be benevolent, restrained by ritual, and guided by virtue. Law was still necessary, but it was meant to be administered by virtuous men.
And this is where moral character becomes a political qualification. This is where scholars and poets become ministers and governors.
Yes, the civil service examination system, which would dominate Chinese politics for 2,000 years, begins to emerge here. It's based on mastery of the Confucian classics. So governance was no longer just about administration. It was about moral cultivation. The state itself became a moral organism. And this fusion efficiency tempered by ethics is what allowed that model to sustain itself for 2 millennia.
It gave the state stability.
And a mechanism for orderly succession, the mandate of heaven again, and a clear blueprint for cultural identity.
So if the Han synthesis provided the political and the philosophical model, our next area of focus has to be how they actually scaled that model. How do you project moral governance across a territory that expanded to 2 million square miles?
Right.
The sources call it the invisible empire, ruling by connection, not just by brute occupation.
The Han understood that to govern vast distances, you must synchronize reality. So they ruled by infrastructure. Think of the sheer volume of material needed. They built thousands of miles of roads and canals. They established these vital postal systems using relays of riders
For communication.
for rapid communication. And critically, they built these immense state granaries. These weren't just for storing food in case of a bad harvest. They were economic stabilizers. The government could release grain to regulate prices and prevent local famine, which in turn prevented localized revolts.
They were actively trying to manage stability through logistics. It's so practical.
And they synchronized more than just goods. They unified time itself. By standardizing calendars and measurements, every farmer across the empire knew when to pay their taxes, when to plant their crops, and when local officials were due to arrive, regardless of how far they were from the capital.
When you synchronize time and measurement, you create a shared, controllable reality across the empire.
You do. But the absolute master stroke of this invisible empire, as we've noted, has to be the standardization of the writing script, a system they inherited directly from the kin.
Why was that so important?
It's the glue that made the entire bureaucracy function. You could call it the infrastructure of paperwork. Because the language, the written script, was unified, a contract drafted by a merchant in the subtropical south, in Sichuan, could be perfectly understood by a magistrate issuing a decree in the northern plains of Hebei.
Even if they spoke completely different dialects.
Completely different spoken languages in many cases. The script allowed the capital's mandates to be transmitted and enforced uniformly across immense cultural and linguistic barriers. So the state was felt everywhere, not through a constant military presence, but through taxes, formalized laws, standardized language, and predictable rituals.
That makes the empire feel less like a nation defined by borders and more like a massive interconnected network.
Exactly. A decentralized network that is centrally controlled by synchronized information. And this highly ordered internal identity, this network, naturally forced the Han to define themselves against those who existed outside that network.
The so-called barbarians.
Specifically, the nomadic other to the north, particularly the confederation known as the Xiongnu.
And this contrast wasn't just military, was it? It defined the core Han self-identity.
The contrast was absolutely essential. To the north lived the horse riders, the archers. They were unfixed, migratory, constantly moving. They didn't settle, they didn't farm, they didn't build cities, and they certainly didn't adhere to the structured, complex ritual systems of the Han.
So to the Han, they were the very embodiment of that chaos they had spent millennia fighting against the Yellow River.
They represented disorder, impermanence, and unpredictability. Everything Han culture feared and sought to control.
Which makes the Great Wall so much more than a physical barrier. It becomes a massive psychological declaration.
Absolutely. The wall was a statement. It was a line drawn in the world that separated order inside, settled, cultivated, civilized, through ritual from chaos, which was outside, the wilderness movement, the untamed. And this fundamental binary-shaped Chinese thought for millennia.
So to be Han was to be rooted.
To be rooted, to be cultivated, to honor your ancestors in a fixed place. To be the other was to be rootless, in motion, and dangerous. And this contrast constantly reinforced the internal need for a shared cultural identity and strict adherence to order.
And this devotion to order is perhaps most powerfully expressed in the Han legal system. The Sophists argue it was designed to restore harmony, not necessarily to create what we would call individual justice.
That is a radical point of departure from our modern or even Roman understanding of law. Crime was fundamentally viewed not as a violation of individuals' rights. It was seen as a disruption of the social and cosmic order.
Okay.
Therefore, the goal of punishment was not revenge or even fairness in an abstract sense. It was correction, it was rehabilitation, and most importantly, it was the restoration of balance to the system.
So the focus shifts entirely from intent to impact. It's not what did you mean to do, it's what did you disturb.
Precisely. The severity of the punishment was determined by the hierarchy of the order that you disturbed. For example, a crime committed against an elder, disrupting that crucial filial hierarchy or within the family, was infinitely worse than the exact same crime committed against a stranger,
Why?
because the familial structure was the most sacred foundational layer of the whole societal organism. If you damage that, you risk tearing the entire fabric of society.
This legal and social system treats society as a single, interconnected organism. The health of the whole outweighs the rights or the specific freedoms of the part.
It creates a foundational tension that runs through Chinese history. The system valued harmony and stability over individual fairness or equality. It constrained the individual severely, imposing these vast obligations to your family, to the state, to your ancestors. But the trade-off was that society as a whole gained immense continuity and resilience against collapse. And that profound trade-off remains central to understanding the culture today.
Now that we've established the external political structure, this powerful, moralized, centralized state, we need to look at the internal, often invisible power structures that preserved this continuity,
Right.
particularly within the family. And then how external forces eventually began to reshape the Han soul.
The family unit, the Diya, was explicitly the basic political unit of the empire. The structure of the state was imagined as a large family, and the family was a small state. It was a perfect mirror,
And there was this strict dual nature to power.
a very strict division. Men governed the visible, public state officialdom, the bureaucracy, the military, but women governed the invisible foundation of it all: the home, the internal economy of the household, and the lineage itself.
This makes women the crucial custodians of continuity. If the state collapses, the culture doesn't die because it's being preserved in the home.
That is their formative power. The sources really underscore that women were the primary agents transmitting culture and values from one generation to the next. They managed the complex household economies, they orchestrated the marriage alliances that held the elite together, they preserved the ancestral rituals, which were largely domestic affairs, and, most critically, they shaped the children who would grow up to occupy all the positions in the state.
So a dynasty might fall due to a military defeat or the moral corruption of the emperor, but the mothers remained.
The mothers remained.
Yeah.
And so cultural resilience was guaranteed not by the bronze weapons or the vast road network, but by the quiet persistence of values and memory that were preserved in kitchens, in lullabies, and in mourning ceremonies.
This power was invisible, which made it remarkably durable.
It insulated it from political upheaval. Now, this arrangement often meant that women were publicly silenced and subordinated within the formal Confucian hierarchy, but their control over the domestic sphere, the actual mechanism of cultural reproduction, was immense. They ensured that when a new dynasty rose, the essential cultural logic of order and hierarchy was already embedded in the population.
While this internal structure was so rigid and focused inward, the Han Empire was, perhaps paradoxically, also looking outward, and that's via the Silk Road, primarily for exchange and connection, not just for conquest.
The Silk Road was the bloodstream of meaning for the ancient world. While the Han military did secure the routes, the primary function was exchange. Silk, which was China's light, strong, and universally desired ambassador, traveled westward. But the truly transformative cargo flowed eastward.
What came back?
New breeds of horses from Central Asia, which were vital for the military, glass technology from Rome, spices from India and Southeast Asia, new music, new instruments, and new ideas.
And this constant flowing exchange forced a change in the Han self-identity, didn't it?
It had to. It shifted their identity from being purely internal, we are the cultivated, settled people at the center of the world, to a comparative identity. The awareness of these other vast, powerful, different civilizations operating with different gods, different languages, different political systems, it began to reshape how the Han viewed their own place in the world. It showed them that their civilization was a choice, not the only possibility.
And the most profound import, the one that truly transformed the Han soul, was Buddhism, coming from the Indian subcontinent. It arrived not as an army, but as a philosophical question that Confucianism had, for the most part, conveniently ignored.
It really had. Confucianism was the ultimate guide to social conduct in this life.
Mm.
It told you everything about your duty, your obligations, your place in the hierarchy, how to maintain order. But it provided no comprehensive answer to existential suffering, to the problem of death, or to what happens after this life.
It was a philosophy for society, not for the soul.
Perfectly put. And then Buddhism arrives with this radical, fully developed system focused on impermanence, suffering, and the nature of the self. It asks questions like, why do we hurt? Why does the cycle of birth and death continue?
That concept, that attachment itself causes suffering, that compassion is liberation, that must have been deeply challenging to a society built entirely on strict attachment to family, obligation, and hierarchy.
It introduced a profound softening to that Confucian rigidity. It brought in new concepts like karma, monasticism, and a universal compassion that transcended the boundaries of the family and the state. It introduced a whole new vocabulary: introspection, meditation, and a path toward personal enlightenment rather than just social perfection.
This idea of monastic withdrawal seems particularly revolutionary. For the first time, it offered a mechanism for people to just step outside that relentless cycle of obligation.
It created a new, private moral space. You could voluntarily choose to step away from the family structure, from the tax rolls, from your duties as a son or a subject, and dedicate yourself to spiritual liberation. Now, the state often tried to control this new movement, but the idea itself, that a person could prioritize the liberation of their own soul over the immediate needs of their father or the emperor, was an inner revolution that fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the civilization. It gave the individual, who was otherwise completely constrained for the sake of the whole, a path to a kind of profound personal sovereignty.
This new inner world created by Buddhism then connects back, in a fascinating way, to the original cultural reverence for landscape and historical memory. This takes us into our final section, the moral rhythm of history.
Yes, the blending of these traditions, the Confucian emphasis on being rooted in a place, the Taoist love of nature's flow, and the Buddhist focus on introspection, it transformed Han aesthetics. The relationship between the self and the world became one of, well, resonance.
The sources describe how classical Chinese poetry often externalizes emotion directly into the landscape. You don't just say, I am lonely. You describe the cold autumn leaves falling or the distant silent moon.
It's because the self and the world are not seen as separate. Your emotion is the environment. The mountains aren't just geological features. They become metaphors for spiritual struggle, for stability, or for the distance of memory. Rivers become the flow of time and emotion.
And this is reflected in the art.
Absolutely. When you look at a classical Chinese landscape painting, it often lacks a central perspective, a single vanishing point. The eye wanders through it, just like thought or memory wanders. The art becomes a form of meditation, a depiction of consciousness, a mindscape, not just a simple depiction of the world.
And this sense of resonance links back, full circle, to that foundational connection to the land that we started with the Yellow River.
The land became an archive of memory. Despite the river's destruction, despite political collapse, people always returned and rebuilt. That persistence created cultural continuity. The connection was territorial, it was physical, and it was deeply spiritual. Graves were meticulously marked, visited, and maintained. The dead were always present, they were part of the social fabric.
To belong, therefore, was to belong to a place and its history. This makes exile or displacement just psychologically devastating.
It was the ultimate trauma. To lose the land was to lose your memory, your ancestors, your entire place in the moral rhythm of the world. And this explains the civilization's relentless drive not toward global conquest, but toward preserving and perfecting its world, its specific ordered territory.
And this obsession with memory and place directly informs their view of history itself, which is cyclical, defined by that moral mandate of heaven and what the sources call the cycle of restoration.
This is absolutely critical to understanding Han endurance. When a dynasty decayed, when social turmoil erupted, or when natural disasters struck, it was seen not as some random tragedy, but as a necessity. It was a sign that heaven had withdrawn its mandate because of the moral failure of the ruler.
So this allowed Chinese civilization to integrate revolution, the actual overthrow of a state, into the framework of order itself.
It made collapse predictable and meaningful. And so every new dynasty claimed not to be a radical innovator creating something new. They were always restorers. They were returning to the ancient, pure virtues of a mythical golden age, correcting the imbalance and bringing harmony back to heaven and earth. Every revolution was framed as a return.
So the political culture became fundamentally obsessed with restoration, not with future-facing innovation.
And this constant demand for moral continuity is what created the massive historical record. Chinese historians were not court flatterers writing to celebrate kings. Their job was to teach lessons. They acted as a mirror for rulers.
What does that mean?
It means this relentless, detailed historical writing became the conscience of the state. It was a profound moral accounting where every failure, every cruelty, and every virtue of a past dynasty was preserved in meticulous detail. Rulers knew they would be judged by history, and they knew that judgment would be preserved and used by the next dynasty to justify its own existence.
This constant backward gaze, measuring the present against a golden age that perhaps never even truly existed, must have created this enormous, almost suffocating pressure on every leader.
It created stability because the ideals were fixed and absolute. But it also created the unique Chinese paradox. No ruler was ever good enough. No dynasty was ever pure enough. Perfection existed only in myth and in the idealized past. Yet it was the constant striving for those unreachable ideals of perfect benevolence and order that sustained the civilization. The pursuit of moral perfection became the engine for the imperfect but incredibly enduring political structure.
In that light, it's clear Han's civilization didn't require faith in a singular god or a prophet to endure.
No, it required absolute, institutionalized faith in order, faith in balance, and the profound belief that history has meaning. And that meaning could be read from signs, from the cracks in an oracle bone, from the shifting course of the river, and from the detailed records of the historian. If you maintained order, you maintained the mandate, and you maintained the right to rule.
This has been a truly comprehensive deep dive into the bedrock structures of Han civilization. Before we wrap up, let's quickly synthesize the three great tensions that seem to define its enduring continuity.
I think it comes down to its ability to manage these fundamental internal conflicts. So first, you have the tension between necessity and idealism.
Right.
The philosophical ideal of harmony, balance, and cooperation was born not from some abstract thought, but from the brutal necessity of managing the catastrophic floods of the Yellow River. Cooperation was just survival, which was later formalized into philosophical law.
Okay, what's the second?
The second is the tension between force and virtue. The Han state was a political miracle because it successfully combined the brutal, efficient, centralized administrative machine of the legalist Kinal, all of that raw power of standardization and control, with the moral, benevolent, ritualized soul of Confucianism.
So it created a powerful, scalable state that was structurally obligated to be benevolent.
Exactly. And third, you have the balance between visible and invisible power. The formalized public bureaucracy and military, governed primarily by men, was balanced by the foundational continuity-preserving power residing in the home, governed by women, by ritual, and by ancestral memory.
Which ensured that even if the visible political structure collapsed, the core cultural identity and the logic of order survived intact.
The Han state was remarkable because it created a reproducible political system based on a constant moral rhythm. It could fall and be restored, because the cultural logic remained constant, and it was reinforced by that relentless historical archive.
The empire was designed to fail in a way that guaranteed its eventual virtuous return.
It was stability through controlled moral collapse.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to mull over as you transition back into your day. If Han civilization is perpetually looking backward, measuring the legitimacy of the present leader against a mythological, perfect moral past, what is the unique psychological and political pressure created by living in a civilization that is forever haunted by its own moral history, where innovation is often viewed with suspicion, and the only path to a better future is framed as a return to an idealized past?
Think about the stability that grants, but also the immense weight of historical expectation it imposes on every single subsequent generation.
Until next time, keep digging into the sources.